Tim, when you think about design these days, most of us think of the design of a cup, a chair, a building, perhaps an aircraft. But you and your company, IDEO, have been encouraging people to think big. You're saying design is not just about a product. It can be an experience, a service, a business model, and sometimes even a policy. So how big can this go? Is there any boundary?
The definition of design that I most like is one that came from the famous Nobel Prize-winning computer scientist Herbert Simon back in the 1950s. He described design as whenever we're shaping the world to meet our needs, so we are designing. Mm-hmm. So it's really a question, the limits of design are really, well, how can we shape the world? It's only limited by the extent to which human activity is limited.
Mm. So one thing you said that really impressed me is that design is not for just the rich and the resourceful. It is also for the poor. So can you share with us a few examples where either a business model or a project with real social impact has made a difference?
Perhaps on a sort of much more of a kind of a system sense. We've been working in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa on how to improve the health of teenage girls, particularly around things like birth control and family planning, this kind of thing. And specifically, it's about how to encourage these girls to actually seek out the services that they wouldn't normally go to these clinics.
They get shy.
They're shy, and so we learned a lot from research in things of holding things like nail salons and having these girls come in, and as they were painting their nails, they talked to them about sex education and that kind of stuff. And now we've got very interesting thousands of girls going through these clinics that weren't going through before.
Design thinking is helping a lot of traditional industries to transform, to better adapt to a digital age. So I want to use the industry that I work for, the traditional media industry, which is under siege by a lot of new technology and social media. What has gone wrong with perhaps the mindset of the traditional newspaper people, and what can be done?
What often goes wrong in any industry is that it thinks like an industry. You know, the principle of design and design thinking is that you serve users and you serve your users, right? So you figure out what are the needs that your users and customers really have, and then how do you serve that? If instead you think like an industry, you think about, well, how do I deploy the resources I have in my industry to customers? There's a difference between those two mindsets, right? If you take Netflix, the US company, I think it's an interesting example of a company that moved from one industry to another industry, right? So it started off in the media distribution industry, but then they realized what they needed in order to do that well was their own content. And they didn't worry about the boundary between the distribution industry and the content industry. They just served their users by making content. And now they're a very large and very successful media content, entertainment content business. I would just suggest that unfortunately too many historical companies have really spent too much time worrying about the industry that they're in rather than serving the needs of their customers.
You seem to be very impressed by Xiaomi.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned it a few times. So what have they done right?
There's several things that impress me. Firstly, in fact, what they learned from being a cell phone manufacturer and realizing how hard that was. And they kind of went back to the drawing board a little bit. So the fact that they've gone from cell phones, then to cell phone accessories, and now to smart products and sort of everyday products, they're extending into people's lives. They're following their customers, as we talked about before, and not worrying about what industry they're in. The second thing that's impressive, of course, is that they're at this moment when the Internet of Things is really beginning to mature. So they're able to build products, very ordinary everyday products that collect really interesting data. They're using it to design better products. They're using it to design much more efficient retail. So they have the right products in the right place at the right time. And they're not only doing that, but they're actually then holding a kind of design discipline. It's not particularly innovative as a design language, but it's incredibly well controlled. And I don't think I've never seen a company do that I mean, maybe Muji in Japan does it pretty effectively, but they do that through owning everything they do. I think that all of this added up is actually a new kind of company. I don't think we've seen anything quite like this before.
Well, you talked a lot about data. Just these few days in China, there's this big debate about privacy, data, and innovation.
Not just in China.
Design can be used for good and can be used for bad. And then how do we sort of only do good, not do bad?
You know, I believe that when it comes to data, that we're in a moment of transition, right? We don't yet understand as societies what we're going to ultimately be comfortable with. So for me, the important principle around data is really more to do with transparency rather than privacy. I'm less concerned about whether my data is private, but I do actually want to know that you have my data. I'd like to have my data too. Right? And I'd like for maybe other people to provide me with tools that would allow me to use that data in interesting ways for me. So those things are just beginning to get themselves figured out, whether that's in China or America or Europe, right? Those questions are just beginning to be asked.
A very well-known industrial design expert, Professor Liu Guanzhong from Tsinghua, he has this famous point that design thinking is probably the one thing that will prevent human beings from extinction. Do you agree with this?
Yes and no. Right. So on the yes side, I would say that the things that make us most human are the things that the machines have most difficulty replicating. Right. So one of those things that makes us most human is what I would call our intentionality, our desire to affect the world around us. We are literally programmed to do that, right? And machines don't care about that. But there are other things that make us human, like empathy, our desire to try and understand each other. Love makes us human. Caring makes us human. The one thing that I do know is that for all of us, we can't just leave the technology to determine its own future. And so one of the things that designers have to do, and others, is to be actually actively engaged in how this technology evolves.
Point to the right direction.
Literally get our hands on the technology and help it evolve, and not just leave it to the technologists and the engineers. They are wonderful and they have great skills, but they're not always the best at understanding what people need, right? And so our responsibility as designers is to understand the technology well enough that we can help it evolve.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great fun.
That was wonderful.
Thanks.